All right. Is everybody in? Okay. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. Thank you for joining us tonight and being patient with us as we get started this evening. Tonight, we are hosting the Reducing Property Taxes with Homestead Tax Exemptions and Appeals course. We know that the April 1st deadline is right around the corner, so we wanted to provide an opportunity for you all to get some information that might prove helpful to you in reducing that property tax bill. So I want to start with some introductions here. My name is Kendra Moore. I'm the NPU Programs Manager. And I have with me tonight Tony McNeil. So I'll pass it to you so that he can introduce himself, and then we'll finish out the introductions there.
Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to be with you tonight. I am Tony McNeil. I'm the Senior Program Coordinator with Outreach and Engagement, Department of City Planning, Neighborhood Planning Units. Good to be here.
Thank you. And we also have on the call with us Dominga Porter.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Dominga Porter, Project Manager with the NPU team, Department of City Planning.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And I'll introduce our instructor in just a second. Before we get there, did want to just go over a few classroom rules before we get started. So first and foremost is to please keep your microphone muted. That way we don't have a lot of background noise. If you are wanting to receive credit for this course, we do advise to please keep your cameras on. That will allow us to know that you are present and actively engaged in this course. In order to ask questions, definitely you can utilize the chat. We'll be monitoring that throughout the course. But there is also a React button that I'll show you down at the bottom of your Zoom screen. That once you click on that, there is an option to raise hand. We will use that feature mostly at the end where we will have a Q&A session. You can utilize that feature, but also definitely utilize the chat as well. And then the last thing is just keep the questions related to the course content at hand tonight. And we'll take it from there. And as promised, there's a little graphic if you have any questions about where to do the raise hand for the Q&A section. So as promised, tonight leading our course, we have with us Stacey Reynolds, who's a staff attorney over the Senior Citizens Law Project with Atlanta Legal Aid. She has done this course for us before, and honestly, we got such a good reception from it last year. We had to bring it back again, so we are very thankful to have Stacey here tonight to do this course with us and impart this knowledge on you all. So I want to pause here and let Stacey also introduce herself.
Hey, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I do want to, again, I'm Stacey Reynolds. I'm an attorney with the Atlanta Legal Aid, which is basically a nonprofit law firm. We do a variety of civil matters. We don't do any criminal. And I'm in the Senior Citizens Law Project, which represents people who are 60 or older. And as part of that, we've been trying and help people save their homes. And so property taxes became kind of a big issue in trying to help people with that. And just as a little bit of housekeeping, I do want to apologize up front. There may be some interruptions as I'm going through this. I will do my best to minimize those. And well, hopefully my tech issues are behind us. Okay. And then the other thing is that I'm not good at looking at the chat and doing a presentation. So I'm going to rely on the other people here to let me know if they're seeing any questions that they need to interrupt me. Okay. So
yeah, absolutely.
To get started, shall I share my screen?
Yes, go ahead. I'm going to stop sharing and we'll get right into the content.
Okay. Oops. Somehow I've moved that. Okay. Okay. So now are you seeing my my slideshow in the full screen?
Yes, we are.
Okay. And let's see. Oops. Okay. And you've seen, you're now on the truth about tax bills, right? Okay.
Yes, we are. Yep.
I've had these where it did not forward, and so I want to make sure that I'm doing it right before I get started. Okay, now to get started with this, let's talk about what is the tax bill. And everybody knows their tax bill when they get it, and all they do usually is look at that bottom line. But the tax bill is really just sort of the tip of the iceberg for any of these property tax things. It's actually made up of the value of the home, the millage rate, or which is just a fancy word for naming a tax rate, and then the homestead exemption. And the way those three things interact to make your tax bill is you have to understand how the taxes are calculated. So it starts with the tax assessors go out and they figure out what each house is worth. If your house sold in the past year, then they have a fair market value already, because if it was an arm's length transaction, that is the fair market value of the home. But if your house didn't sell in the past year, they're really just sort of guessing at it. What they're going to do is they're looking at other sales in the neighborhood, other things that are going on, condition of your house, that sort of thing. And they're going to guess at what your house value is. And they're going to set that value. From that, you then get taxed on just a portion of that. So the assessed value, or the taxable value, is going to be 40% of that fair market value. So we're trying to do easy math. We got a $100,000 home. 40% of that is 40,000. From that, they're going to subtract any homestead exemptions you get, and then they'll multiply whatever that difference is times the millage rate, times the tax rate, and that's how they figure out what your tax bill is. And they're going to do that on every line of your tax bill. So this is what they're going to do for the county general operating expenses. This is what they're going to do for the schools operating expenses. They're going to do it for each individual line. So different lines will get different exemptions, but they're all going to be basically the same thing. And so basically, again, there are the three pieces that make up your tax bill. There's the value, there's the exemptions, and then there's the millage rate. And so when you're talking about how to lower your tax bill, the way you do that is with your homestead exemptions, property tax appeals, and your millage rate. Homestead exemptions are, we're going to go into in pretty great detail this evening, because the deadline for that is going to be April 1st. We're also going to talk a little bit about the property tax appeals, because that's how you control what they say the value of your house is. And if you lower the fair market value that they say it is, then you actually lower the taxable value. The third thing is a millage rate, and I'm not going to get into that because that's basically a political process that the county, the city, and the schools are going to go through to try and figure out what the tax rate needs to be to meet their budgets. But that is a place that you also have a voice. Okay, so let's start with the homestead exemption. Charlotte Tremble at Grandmama's house always refers to the homestead exemption as your big fat discount coupon. And I love that because it really is what it is. It's sort of like going into a store to buy something, handing them a discount coupon and having them reduce how much you end up having to pay. Because it's going to be deducted directly from the taxable value. The kinds of exemptions that are available: there's a basic exemption that if you are eligible for homestead exemptions, you get it regardless of whether you're a senior or what your income is or any of those things. You just automatically get it. Now you do have to apply. It's not just, they're not going to just know that you're living in that home. You have to apply for it, but it is something that you can get, again, regardless of age or income. There are additional exemptions that are that will be on top of what the basic exemption is. And those are going to be triggered by certain life events. Like, as you age, there's going to be additional exemptions at 62, 65, 70. people who are disabled can get the exemptions, the senior exemptions at a younger age. Also a disabled veteran or their unremarried surviving spouse or minor children, the surviving spouses of a U.S. service member, police officer, or firefighters who are killed in the line of duty. All of those will be able to get some additional exemption, what you would get with the basic exemption. With a lot of those, there are some income limits. The income limits, for the most part, do not count Social Security. So, so if you're retired, there's a good chance that you'll qualify for them, even though the amounts that they show for the limits are really, really low. So if you're in one of these categories, it's worth at least checking with the assessor's office to see if you might be eligible for additional exemptions. Floating exemption. So I'm sure all of you have heard a lot in the press about the floating exemption because it's something it's actually been around for the city of Atlanta and Fulton County for quite a long time, but they just did that statewide one. And all the different jurisdictions were looking at whether they needed to opt out. I am disappointed to report that the city of Atlanta schools did opt out. That was the one that I was really hoping, because I think that's where y'all could get a really good discount. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. But, you know, the way the floating exemption works is that rather than the taxable value going up the full amount as what you see when you're when your notice of assessment comes and shows what your value is, it caps that taxable value so that instead of it going up, let's say your house value went up, 50%, it's going to cap that taxable value. Instead of going up 50%, it's going to just go up like no more than 3%. And so that can really keep your tax bill down, and also makes it more predictable. So this graphic is actually, if the dark blue waves were the home value, the taxable value would be capped down at the light blue waves, and your exemption basically kind of floats along that. So, and they tend to use floating exemption, value cap, and freeze all together. They sort of mix them all together. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, what is the floating exemption using math. So I apologize in advance. This is math, but this is the way it made sense to me. When the city of Atlanta first got the floating exemption, I thought of it as a value cap, and I kept getting questions from people saying, well, wait, didn't I have a value cap? Why is my tax bill still going up? And the reason is because it does go up a little bit each year. So the example is that if your home value is $250,000, then 40% of that is $100,000. But let's say the base year, which is, let's say last year was the first year you started getting this homestead exemption. And so your base year was locked in at last year's value of $50,000. And this year it went up to $100,000. But the floating exemption makes sure that your taxable value doesn't go up any more than 3%. So a $50,000 home could only go up $1,500 in 1 year rather than going up 50,000. And as a result, so as a result, the actual taxable value using this floating exemption is going to be capped at $51,500. From that, they're going to subtract any other exemptions you have to be able to get to what the net assessment is, and then multiply that times the millage rate. And so the value cap line is what makes sense to me mathematically, because the taxable value is capped at $51,500. You subtract exemptions, and then you've got what you're being taxed on. But the way your tax bill actually looks in Fulton County is that they'll actually take that savings that you get because of the value cap, and they add it to the other exemptions. And so it'll actually show up on your tax bill as a larger exemption instead of a lower taxable value. But it ends up being the same. You end up with the same amount of taxes owed. And the reason this is important is because even with the basic exemption, you end up saving a good bit on your taxes with the floating exemption. By comparison, the Atlanta City schools, even if you had the highest senior exemption, you end up paying more in tax than the school taxes. So the example here is that you still have that same $250,000 home. It's being taxed at $100,000. This time, instead of using the floating exemption, what I've put down is the highest senior exemption that they have, which is $75,000. And so even though that's the highest senior exemption that's available, you still end up with a higher net assessment, a higher value that you're being taxed on than if you had the floating exemption. And the millage rate for the schools tends to be higher, so you end up seeing a bigger jump on your tax bill because of the school taxes. So this is where the floating exemption would make a huge difference, but it does still make a big difference in your city and your county taxes. Okay, so again, just to hammer home how great the floating exemption is and homestead exemptions generally. Here's an example that's going to go back to 2018 because that's the floating exemption for the city of Atlanta went into effect in 2019. So this is an actual tax bill for a person who was getting the high senior exemptions from 2018. Without changing the actual value that the county had for the property or any of the exemptions, just adding in the floating exemption and also increasing the school exemption a little bit. In 2019, her tax bill ended up being cut almost in half. So it made a huge difference. And that's all because of the homestead exemption. In that case, when the 2019 floating exemption went into effect, they actually put in the base year as before 2018. So that meant that because her value had been lower in 2017 than it was in 2018, it resulted in an immediate drop in her taxes. For people who get the floating exemption now, it's probably going to be a much more gradual thing, but over time, you're going to end up seeing that where it ends up saving a good bit of money on the taxes. Okay, so who's eligible? And this is where I get really passionate. The general thing that people say is that if you own your home and live in it, then you're eligible for homestead exemptions. And you are. That's easy. That's definitely the easy case, and it's also just the easy way to describe it. But the actual people who are eligible is a little bit broader than that. There are actually some people who are able to get the exemptions who don't necessarily have a deed in their names. Now, it does have to be your primary residence. You have to live in the home. You can't get it on a home that you're not living in. And you can't get it on a home that you're renting out or that someone else is using. But again, if you have a deed in your name, you're actually going to get the exemption. That's the easy one. And that's true even if you own it jointly with people. And even if those other people don't live in the home or have exemptions somewhere else, you can still get the exemption on your home, except in the cases of spouses. And I'll talk about that in a minute. If someone has a life estate in the home, so they don't have a full ownership, they only have a life estate, then they're eligible for the homestead exemption just because of the life estate. A person with a contract for the purchase of the home, where the end result is that they'll own the home, they should be able to get the homestead exemption. And again, if it's a contract, it's not actually a deed, but they should be able to get it. A person who resides in the home that's owned by a parent who is deceased or incapacitated should be able to get the homestead exemption regardless of whether the property has been distributed. So, and because it can be, you can get the exemption even if the property has not been distributed, you should be able to get it because even if there's no deed. Because if the deed had been had transferred the property to the children, then that's distributing the property. A person who resides in the home that he or she will inherit, but the home is being probated, should still be able to get the homestead exemption while the property is vested in the administrator or the executor. So this is really, these last two are really key for legacy homeowners trying to keep the home affordable while they're dealing with any sort of probate. We hear a lot about heirs property and, the problems with being able to pay the taxes or losing the home because of the taxes or other things that happen. These are ways that they should be able to try and manage those expenses while they go through that process. A person who resides in a home that's in a trust, and if they're the beneficiary under a trust, then they should be able to get the homestead exemption. They'll just have to show the trust documents to show that they really are the beneficiary. And the spouse of a homeowner who lives in the home is eligible for the homestead exemption, even if it's not in their name. But spouses can only have one exemption. And so if you have multiple properties, you can't split up and have, one spouse getting a homestead exemption on one property and the other spouse getting a homestead exemption on the other property. And that's true even if they are completely separated, own their homes individually. Because they're married, they're only going to be entitled to one exemption. So that's one thing to keep in mind. If you are applying for the homestead exemptions, if the deed is in your name, you probably won't even have to show the deed. But if you are applying for the homestead exemption and you fall into one of the other categories where you don't necessarily have a deed in your name, be aware that you should try and bring along with you any of the documents that link you to that last deed so that it's clear that you qualify for the exemptions. Again, you have to live in the home. This has to be your primary residence. There are some exceptions, but for the most part, those are going to come into play more when, after you've had the home for a while, had the homestead exemption. They can't remove the homestead exemption just because you're out of the house for health reasons. They're going to be less important when it comes to applying for the homestead exemptions. Deadline. You must file your application by April 1st. If you apply on April 2nd, you are applying for next year. You can apply year round, but again, if it's not submitted on or before April 1st, then you're not going to be able to get the exemption for this year. Be sure to check with your city. Now, the city of Atlanta does use the Fulton County as their to handle their exemptions and all of that stuff. But some cities actually don't. So, talking to people outside of the city of Atlanta, they want to check with their city to make sure that there aren't any additional exemptions they need to deal with there. Get proof that you filed by the deadline. Again, April 1st is the deadline. If you're mailing it, it has to be postmarked on April 1st. And so you want to be sure to mail it in a way that you're going to be able to prove the date you mailed it and that they received it. If you're doing it online, you want to be sure that you get that confirmation that it actually did get submitted. It'll send you an email and it'll also give you a screen showing that it's been submitted. You want to be sure to save those so that you have proof that you actually did file it by the deadline. And if you're going in person, you want to be sure to get a receipt to show that you actually did file it. If you are denied and you should have gotten it, then you want to appeal it. Also, if you get your notice of assessment and you made a timely a timely application for the homestead exemption and the notice of assessment doesn't show it, you should go ahead and appeal that. It's a good chance that the city is, or the county is still working on processing all the applications because they get so many. But you want to be able to preserve your appeal rights. And you want to be sure to appeal if you're not getting the exemption that you should be getting. There are some tax deferral options for people who are 62 or older. They're very strict on the income, and also there are some limits on how much equity has to be in the house. So I'm not going to go into them in detail, but I want to make sure that you know they're available. Okay. So when I start talking about appeals, one of the first things I usually talk about is reading the notice of assessment. But one of the things the law that passed last year did is it changed what the notice of assessment is going to look like. So this is the old version, and it's got all the different things that you need to look for. Most of this is also going to be on the new version. It's just that it may not be laid out quite the same, and especially the estimated taxes due, it's not clear whether that's going to be on there or not. I don't actually have an actual sample of the new version, but the Department of Revenue has put out sort of their own sample. And so it's not filled in, it's a little bit harder to read, but this is what it looks like. It's still got the key, the really big thing you want to look at for doing appeals is you want to look and see what the date that they issued it and the deadline for the appeal, because the date that they issue it, and this is not the date that you receive it, the date they issue it, you have 45 days from that date to be able to appeal it. So once that deadline is passed, you are not able to appeal anymore. So it's really important when you get this, and it says this is not a bill. And so people will set it aside, won't think about it. You need to think about it because this is your one window to be able to appeal that value. And again, by appealing the value, you're going to reduce the taxable value. It's going to show you the exemption status. Now, the exemption status is going to be there as a code, and you're just going to have to figure out if you're actually getting the exemptions that you should be getting. If you're not sure what the code means, you can call the assessor's office and ask them. HF01 is basic, but beyond that, there's a whole bunch of other numbers that they use. And so you may have to call the assessor's office just to make sure that you are getting all the exemptions you should be getting. It's going to give you the previous year and the current year values. And it's going to be, they'll show both the fair market value as well as the assessed value. They're also, this in the new version, they're also going to give you the floating exemption value. Because that not all of the jurisdictions are going to have that floating exemption value, I believe they will have different categories for each of the different jurisdictions. What I'm not sure about is if it'll appear here or down below. The other thing that they're supposed to do with the notice of assessment this year is they're supposed to show the rollback rate in addition to those exemption values. The rollback rate is what the taxing authority rate to not, well, so it's what they should use for the millage rate to be able to get the amount of taxes that they did last year. And so because the home values tend to go up, the amount that they get, if they use the exact same millage rate as last year, the amount that they would get is more because the values have gone up. And so what they want to do is show that actually, if they keep the millage rate the same and the values have gone up, then they're actually getting more money. And they want to make it clear that that is what's happening. And so the new notice of assessment should show that rollback rate. And that's all very confusing. And I have to admit, I'm still waiting to see what the real thing looks like so that maybe I can understand it a little better and hopefully explain it a little bit better. Okay. Now, again, the estimated taxes due, I think is pretty helpful for people to be able to sort of get a sense of what this value is going to do to their tax bill. It's always been just an estimate. It's always been, sort of guessing at what the jurisdiction might have. So in the past, what they've done is they've used last year's millage rate to show what the estimated taxes are with this new value. I don't know if they're going to have that anymore. There was initially, they were saying that they will not have that. And then I've been hearing other things saying that actually it will be there. So again, I'm not sure what this is going to look like this year. Okay. So here are tax appeals in a nutshell. The tax appeal is your chance to argue for a lower value in order to lower the taxable value. It's also your chance to show eligibility for homestead exemption. So again, if you get denied a homestead exemption, you can appeal that and then show that you should be getting the exemption. You do have to appeal within 45 days of when you get the notice of assessment. Again, that changes every year. Usually it comes out in the May-June timeframe, but it's not going to be a set day. With the applying for homestead exemptions, you have a set deadline. There's no such thing in the tax appeal. It all is dependent on when that notice of assessment comes out. The value freeze. So when you appeal, if you see it through and go to the Board of Equalization or get an agreement on the value with the assessor's office, if that value is lower than what was in the notice of assessment, even if it's just lower by $1, you get a freeze for 3 years, which means that they can't increase your value for 3 years. So that can end up being a tremendous savings in itself because, as we know, the values keep going up. And so it wouldn't do that for the year you appealed or the 2 years after. The Board of Equalization is not scary. And this is something I just really want to stress because a lot of people think that, oh my God, I can't do a hearing, it just sounds so scary. And the Board of Equalization, that just sounds so formal. Really, all it is 3 people like you who are taxpayers in Fulton County. And well, I guess if you're City of Atlanta, DeKalb County, then they'll be DeKalb County residents. But they're just taxpayers who are chosen to hear these cases. They get a little bit of training, but mostly they're. And so you're just presenting to those 3 people why you think your value should be lower. And then the county will provide their argument for why they think the value is right. And then it's up to the Board of Equalization to decide which one they think is correct. If you can provide some evidence that supports a lower value, there's a good chance you can convince them to lower it at least a little bit. So it's worth trying. You do have to provide some sort of evidence, though. You can't go in and say, oh, I can't afford my taxes. Unfortunately, there's nothing they can do about that. What they can do is if you go in and explain, well, the condition of my house is not as good as the county thinks it is. And so it would be, if I were selling my house today, it would be selling for a lot less than what they say. If you can provide some sort of evidence, or point to other houses in the neighborhood, houses that have sold that would show that your value would be lower, or the other houses are being assessed, or being taxed at an amount. Sorry, the value that the county is saying for other houses that are similar to yours, if those are lower, then that's not fair. And so you should point to those to say, I should have a lower value because other houses like mine are being assessed lower. And because I'm a graphic person, I found this on Facebook. Unfortunately, I don't know who created it, so I can't give credit to it. But this to me really does explain what it is you're trying to do in a tax appeal. Basically, what you're trying to do is provide some sort of evidence that shows that your home is the modest home that it is, as compared to the, grand palace that the assessor's office seems to think your house is. So you're basically just trying to find whatever evidence you can provide to show really what your house value should be to be able to lower that value. This is the property tax timeline. So these are sort of the key dates in what we're talking about. January 1st is going to be the key date for being eligible for a homestead exemption. So you have to, if you're going to get a senior exemption, you have to be that age by January 1st. Whatever your ownership interest in the property, that has to have started as of January 1st. So, if you buy the house on January 2nd, you're not going to get the homestead exemption until the following year. You're still going to be, subject to whatever exemption was on there for the prior owner because they owned it as of January 1st. But your own exemption isn't going to be till the following year. So, but you want to be sure to apply for it, in the year in which you're eligible for it. And in order to do that, you have to apply by April 1st. That is going to be the deadline. Again, the notice of assessment is going to come out sometime in the May-June timeframe. Once it comes out, that 45 days is set. As soon as it comes out, you have 45 days to be able to appeal. And then at the end of that time, you no longer have the right to appeal. And the key here is that you notice that the time for the tax bills coming out is after that deadline. So by the time you get your tax bill, it is too late to appeal. So it's really important to pay attention to that notice of assessment when it comes out. If you have appealed and, if you have appealed, they're not going to have processed your appeal in time to have the corrected value for your tax bill. So what the tax bill is going to do is give you a temporary tax bill. And that temporary tax bill is generally going to be based on either 85% of the notice of assessment value or last year's value, whichever is lower. And that's going to, that tax bill does need to be paid. So, don't ignore it just because you've got an appeal pending. And then what will happen is once the whole appeal process is done, when they have a final value, then they'll recalculate your taxes. And if you end up owing less than what was in the temporary tax bill, they'll give you a refund. If you end up owing more, they'll send you a new tax bill for that difference, and you'll have to pay that. You'll have 30 days to pay that. So while they're going through the process to process these appeals, you'll first get something from the county basically saying, yes, we've gotten your appeal. And then they'll say, okay, we got it, and we're going to change your value, in which case you'll get something that looks very similar to the notice of assessment and give a new value. And you have a choice of either accepting that or appealing it to the Board of Equalization. You only have 30 days from that one. And there's not going to be a big public outcry because they're going to be sort of processing them ad hoc. So you want to be sure that if you get something else that looks like a notice of assessment, that you look and see what that deadline is to appeal and decide if you want to appeal it. The other thing they might send you is what we call a no change letter, which is basically the county saying, okay, we're not going to change what we think the value is. We're going to send it on to the Board of Equalization. Those notices usually go out. A lot of times they go out sometime in the fall. And then the Board of Equalization will start scheduling their hearings, usually in, August, September, and then they'll keep having hearings. They're actually still having hearings from the appeals that were filed last year. So, they keep going until they've finished all of the appeals. And then a lot of times they start back over with the next year. But once the Board of Equalization has heard it, then they'll issue a final value, and that's what gets processed for the final bill. You do have a right to appeal to Superior Court if you're not happy with the Board of Equalization decision. That becomes a little bit more formal, but it also allows for attorney's fees if there's enough of a reduction. And so you might be able to get an attorney to help you with that a little bit easier than with some of the other appeals. Again, what we're aiming for is you be able to afford to pay your property taxes, but I do want to give a quick explanation of what happens if you don't pay your property taxes. So the taxes come due. If you don't pay them by the due date, then interest starts to accrue and there'll be penalties. And so all that stuff, so it becomes more expensive. Then they'll issue a lien, what they call a 5-FA. And that lien is going to be issued to show that you do own the property. That you do owe money on that property. And so it's going to be in the lien records. In Fulton County, they may transfer that lien. They have an agreement not to transfer liens for people who are getting the senior exemptions, but just having a basic exemption is not going to keep you from getting it transferred. And so they'll go to a third party. And either way, whoever holds those tax liens eventually can foreclose on that tax lien. What they do is they do a levy, which is basically just sort of giving notice that they're planning on doing a tax foreclosure. And then they do a tax foreclosure, which is sometimes also called as a tax deed sale. The tax foreclosure is basically, it ends up looking a lot like a mortgage foreclosure. They go out on the courthouse steps on the same day that the mortgage foreclosures happen, the first Tuesday of a month, and they'll auction it off. But the person who's buying it at a tax foreclosure actually gets a tax deed, they don't get full ownership. That tax deed is going to be subject to the right to redeem. And you have at least 1 year from that tax foreclosure to be able to redeem. After that, they can foreclose the right to redeem, which is basically just sort of going through a notice process to give you a deadline to pay the redemption amount. And the redemption amount is a lot more expensive. Instead of just owing the taxes and some interest and maybe some, recording costs for the liens, suddenly what you're paying is whatever was paid on the courthouse steps plus 20% of that, and then it goes up another 10% every year on the anniversary. And so what that means is, let's say you had $100,000 home, the taxes owed were like $2,000. Even with the penalties and interest and all that stuff, let's say maybe $3,000 was owed. You can pay the $3,000 and be done. Except once they've gotten to that tax foreclosure, if they auction it off on the courthouse steps, you're going to be paying whatever they paid on the courthouse steps, and plus 20% of that. So let's say $100,000 home. Let's say they pay $50,000 for the home. They're getting a deal. They're getting it half price. or they're going to get $70,000 or $60,000 in return. They're going to get a 20% return on their money. And so if you're able to come up with the money to be able to pay that redemption amount, then you redeem. If you don't, they're going to foreclose that right to redeem. And once that deadline is passed, you've lost the house. And so it's really important to try and keep that from happening. And really the key to that is trying to make sure that the taxes are able to be paid before the deadline. Okay, quick recap, and then we'll go into questions. Homestead exemptions get subtracted from the taxable value. Again, it's your big fat, discount coupon. You must apply for the exemptions. And if as you age or, fall into some of those other categories, you need to reapply. You need to go back and apply again. Now, with almost all of the exemptions, once you apply once, you're going to continue getting them as long as you continue to be eligible. The one exception is there is one Fulton County low income exemption that actually will fall off you have to reapply every 2 years, but for most of them, they'll just continue. The deadline is April 1st to be able to get the exemptions for the current year. You should appeal if you are denied, or if you can also appeal if you're not allowed to apply. So if you go in and try to apply and they say, oh no, you don't have a deed in your name, you can't apply, appeal that. I would actually start with trying to push them to actually accept the application. And if they want to deny it, then okay, you can appeal that. But if they just won't let you file an application, then, when the notice of assessment comes out, go ahead and appeal it and explain that you tried to file your application and you weren't given the opportunity to do that. Tax appeals. You're arguing to reduce the value in order to reduce the taxable value on the home, which will then reduce your taxes. You do need to present evidence that shows that the value should be lower than what it is. The Board of Equalization is not scary. It really is not. And you get a 3-year freeze if you're able to get the value lowered at all. So it ends up being, sort of a double win that way. Okay, if you have questions, I've got my contact information here, and then we can go to questions for the group. Stop sharing my.
Thanks so much for that, Stacey. That was a wealth of information. So really appreciate that. We do have quite a few questions in the chat, so I'm going to go through those. If you have a question that you have not dropped in the chat, this is where you can use the raise hand feature. Then we'll come to that group once we address these questions from the chat. So the first question that came was, if I purchase a new home after April 1st, would I still be applying for the following year?
Yes, basically, if you didn't own the home before January 1st, then you're definitely going to be applying for the following year. So. Okay,
perfect. And then the next question was, having a yes under exemption status means all the exemptions have been applied, or only that I am eligible to apply?
If it shows yes under the exemptions on your notice of assessment, then it means you are getting some exemptions. It usually will say yes, dash, and then some sort of code. If you're getting a basic exemption, it's going to say yes, dash, HF01. If it says HF46 or HF46F, or, it has a whole variety of other numbers and letters that they use, it's probably a good idea to call the assessor to just check to make sure that you're getting the exemptions you applied for. Just to make sure that you are getting the ones that you should be getting. And if you applied for some that are higher than the basic and it just says 01, you want to be sure to appeal that.
Thank you for that. Next question we have. So it says, I bought a house in 2023, applied for homestead exemption before April 1st and got it. But now for 2024, property taxes increased over $800 monthly. And the only reason I see that I'm not getting the same exemption as the previous owner is that the assessed value increase assessed value increase has been meaningless. What can I do to increase the homestead exemption so I can get a reduction in the tax bill?
So there may be a couple of things going on in that increase. So let's say you bought the house in 2023 and applied for the exemptions in 2023. Technically, the exemptions you were getting in 2023 are the exemptions from the prior homeowner. So your exemptions don't go into effect until 2024. And the prior homeowner probably, if they had exemptions, they probably had a floating exemption that had a base year that was earlier. Your base year is going to be the year before you start getting your exemptions. So again, in this case, it would be 2023. So it's going to be whatever the value was that year is going to be your base year for the floating exemption. And then they would subtract out any other exemptions that you get. And so if the person you bought it from had the senior exemptions and you're not getting the senior exemptions, then that'll make a difference. So that, there's a variety of different factors that go into it.
Thank you for that. Okay, next question was, so if I've applied to Fulton County, does that also go to the city of Atlanta? There's no separate application?
That's correct. Again, some of the other cities do require a separate application, especially for some senior exemptions. But City of Atlanta then relies entirely on Fulton County for doing the exemptions.
Okay, thank you for that. Oops, sorry. The next question that we have here is, does the city or county use the average value of all houses in your neighborhood to come up with a value for your house? What if you live in a neighborhood undergoing gentrification and you've done nothing to your home, but there are $1 million plus homes going up around you? Do they assess your home based on those values?
That's a great question. And it's not a really simple answer, but when you look at your notice of assessment, it'll say neighborhood, it'll have a code there, or if you look up your property on the Fulton Assessor's website, it'll have a neighborhood code. What they've done is they've carved up the county into different neighborhoods. Now, what their code is may not be the same as what you think of as your neighborhood, but what they're trying to do is keep similar homes together. And so you'll see in some areas, like I know I was looking at some properties in Old Fourth Ward, which of course underwent a few different versions of gentrification. And so what they were trying to do is sort of keep sort of like the old bungalow houses in one neighborhood and then the triplexes in a different neighborhood code. And so, even though the houses were kind of on the same street or in generally this what we would think of as the same neighborhood, they tried to separate them out to try and make it so that you're being compared more to similar homes. And just generally, they should be looking at more similar homes for setting what your value is. And so they shouldn't be comparing, again, the 1940s, post-war build to the, extra modern, infill housing that you get in a lot of the neighborhoods. Those are just very different homes, different sizes, different values. Those should be different. But sometimes they have a hard time finding similar homes. And so they can do sort of a price per square foot comparison or, try and do it. But that's where you have some really good arguments with the tax appeal to try and say that, if you look at the homes that are really like mine, it's a much lower value, or there aren't homes like mine. And that's why your whole thing is skewed and it should be lower. If I were to sell my house, I wouldn't be able to sell it for this. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you. And if anyone had follow-up questions, that you could just raise your hand and let us know. Okay, next question up was, how does getting a homestead exemption affect yearly taxes? I'm assuming getting an exemption on property taxes means you get less exemptions on your state or federal tax, but is that accurate? And does getting the exemption one year affect your exemptions for the next year?
Great question. Because that's one of those things that I always forget to mention, your property taxes is completely separate from your income taxes. So when you're talking about your federal and state taxes, I assume you're talking about the income taxes. You may be able to do a deduction for your property taxes, but it's not dependent on those at all. So whatever exemptions you get on your property taxes does not affect, whatever exemptions you're able to claim on your income tax. And in a sense, what the exemptions you get in 1 year do affect the following year, because again, at least for the county and the city taxes, you get a floating exemption. And that floating exemption is going to mean that the longer you've had that exemption, the more it saves you, because the home values tend to go up a lot more than the rate of inflation. And because the taxable value has been capped closer to the rate of inflation, is basically it's the consumer price index or 3%, whichever is less. And so so that taxable value has been going up a lot more gradually. And so the longer that you have it, the more you're going to end up saving because of that.
So thank you. The next question was, do you know where can I find or where can I research the prior year's home comparable sales by month for my area?
I don't know that you can do it by month. I wish you could, but so one of the really great things that Fulton County has, if you go to the Fulton Assessor website, is fultonassessor.org. They actually have two different ways to look up properties. There's the enhanced property search and the basic property search. And if you use the enhanced property search, you can look up your property. And then there's a place where you can actually search for comparable properties. And it's basically just hitting a button. And it'll allow you to, it then brings up like a whole set of search criteria. The one thing that I wish they had in there was, so it defaults to searching for homes that have sold in the past 12 months. And by the time you're doing this, you're usually, around 6 months into the year, which means that you're doing 6 months of the current year and 6 months of the past year. And when you're looking at comparable sales, you actually want to look at the sales for the prior year. So like for a 2025 appeal, they're going to be looking at the sales that happened in 2024. And so when you pull up that whole search screen, you want to scroll down to the bottom and change it so that instead of doing just the last 12 months, that it actually has a search dates that it's searching. And so it's only searching for January 1st, 2024 through December 31st, 2024. So that you're just getting the sales that really compare to your home. And then you can actually download it as a spreadsheet, and it has just all the data, the number of bedrooms that they have, the square footage, the condition that they think the home is worth, all the information that you would normally do when you're trying to find similar homes. It's all there in a spreadsheet, and you can sort it, and it makes it a lot easier to be able to find what are good arguments for a tax appeal.
Awesome. Thank you, Stacy. Okay, so the next one we have, it says, in the evidence section of your PowerPoint, you stated if their house is about the same as your house and you think they pay lower taxes, is there a way to find out if they are paying lower or find out what their home is worth to show evidence that I can pay lower as well? And then the second part was they noticed that they have a CPI frozen statement on their tax bill. Can you shed any light on what that might mean?
So the first question, and I may have misspoke, and so I apologize. When you're looking at a tax appeal, you're not looking at how much the person is paying in taxes, because there are a variety of things that could go into that, especially the homestead exemptions. So the amount that they pay in taxes may be different. What you want to do is look at what does the county say that house is worth. And if they're saying that that house is worth less than what your house is worth, especially if the price per square foot is different, then you want to say, well, that's not fair. They're being taxed at a lower amount. And so technically it's not the amount of taxes they're paying, it's the value that they've put on it that results in an unfair treatment of how they're taxed. As of the second part, the CPI freeze is just referring to the floating exemption. The CPI is the consumer price index. And so it's saying that you have the value can't go up more than the CPI amount or 3%, whichever is lower.
Thank you for that. All right, the next question we have is, can you touch on HB 581 home exemption legislation and clarify, one, if the new floating homestead exemption is in addition to and not in lieu of all non-floating homestead exemptions? Two, modify the 3-year lock statute for appeals so that taxpayers only receive the benefit of the lock if they receive a value reduction upon appeal. And let me know if I need to repeat those pieces.
I may need the second piece again, but I think I got it. But okay. So House Bill 581 is the thing that, so we all voted on one piece of that last November. And the decision was that everyone wanted that floating exemption. And so that passed. And what it did is it created a statewide opt-out baseline for the floating exemptions. Before, you could get floating exemptions, and again, Fulton and City of Atlanta already had floating exemptions that they had basically opted into. They had passed legislation to get it for themselves. This then flipped it so that instead of having to actually go through those steps, people, the local jurisdictions had to actually get together and vote to opt out. The hope was that politically they wouldn't want to go on record saying, oh, well, we don't want to save our homeowners money. At least I kind of guess that's what they're thinking. And so more of these jurisdictions that did not have floating exemptions would have them in the future. And I think some of them are going to have that floating exemption that didn't have it before, but a lot of them opted out. And so there's actually legislation pending now that may change that as well. So that's still a little bit up in the air. But with that and with the floating exemptions that already existed in Fulton and City of Atlanta, those are in addition to all your non-floating exemptions. So again, what the floating exemption does is sort of caps the taxable value, and then from that you subtract any other exemptions you're getting. And that's true whether it's the new one or the and I've forgotten what the second part of it was. I knew I did.
The second part of it was it says modify the 3-year lock statute for appeal so that taxpayers only receive the benefit of the lock if they receive a value reduction.
Yeah, and so that's the other thing that the House Bill 581 actually did a whole variety of things. The floating exemption was one piece of it. They actually adjusted a bunch of other stuff. And one of the things they did, so it used to be that if you appealed your value, no matter what, if you saw it through, no matter what, you would actually get a freeze for the 3 years. So even if you ended up with a notice of assessment value, at least you could fall back on the fact that you didn't get an increase for the following 2 years. And so that ended up being kind of a win, even if you lose. Now you actually do have to have it reduced. They've changed it so that in order to get that 3-year freeze, you have to have some sort of reduction as a result of the appeal.
Thank you so much, Stacey. We're almost, and we got a few more questions in here. This is, I think, maybe similar to one we've asked, but I'll pose it here. It says, I have evidence that my neighbor paid less tax in his and his house is in disrepair. What damage am I doing to my own value by claiming a challenge to my tax assessment?
Okay, and I apologize, I've got some background noise here, but so again, what you need to look at is not how much they're paying in taxes, but what the county says the house is worth. if they're saying that a house that is in better shape is worth less than what yours is, or the same as what they say yours is, then you need to argue that no, that's not right. My house is clearly is in worse shape. It clearly should be a lower value. So that's where you want to look for your tax appeal, and then lowering that value will then lower the taxable value, and the homestead exemptions will add to that discount.
Sorry, I was muted there. Thank you for that, Stacey. Okay, let's see here. There was a question about the annual notice of assessment letter. Do you know when those are released for 2025?
That's one of those things that we always keep trying to predict. I actually do, with the Atlanta Beltline Partnership and Grove Park Foundation, we usually do a presentation and some workshops to try and help people with filing their appeals. And we always try to set those ahead. But it all just comes down to when the assessors are ready to issue them. Again, it's usually actually the last several years, it's always been in June. They try and do it sometime in May. And it's just if they can get it all ready in time, then they'll get it out, as soon. Basically, so they're closing the books on April 1st, which is why that's the deadline for getting your homestead exemptions in. And then once they've closed the books, they then have to process everything to try and make sure that they have all the values. I don't know. There's a whole process they have to go through to be able to create what they call the digest. And once that's created, then they have to vote to approve it. And then once the Board of Assessors has voted to approve it, then they send out the notice of assessments. So we try and predict it, but it just varies. The one thing you can do, if you look up your property on the fultonassessor.org website, it'll actually have the notice of assessment there once it's issued. You can also sign up to have the notice of assessment emailed to you instead of waiting for it by mail. So both of those things are good ways to try and sort of keep on top of it. Just sort of check periodically when you get into that May timeframe. Also keep an eye on the news. The news will often cover especially when it comes out for City of Atlanta, because that's just such a high population.
Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, and I think, let's see here. We have a question here. Is there a separate form or procedure to use when applying for the Atlanta Public School System exemption?
No, and that's the right thing, that because the city bill and the county bill, for City of Atlanta and Fulton County, are both drawing off of the homestead exemptions that are being done by the Fulton Assessor's Office. You don't have to do anything separate for those things. And that's a great question. So I always say, city and county, but the schools is sort of lumped in with the city in that case. It's not lumped in there when you're talking about the millage rate, but that, what homestead exemptions you get, it is.
Okay, let's see here. There was a question about seniors that have to pay the school taxes when they don't have kids in school. Do you have any background on why that is, or that's just part of the city taxes?
I don't have any background. I know the arguments that were made for not doing the floating exemption were all based on the budget. But yeah, that's just one of those that I get so many calls from people saying, wait, I'm a senior, why am I paying school taxes now? And 9 times out of 10, what's happened is that, it's a senior that had the highest exemptions, but the value of the property has finally kind of crept up to where they're starting to pay. If the home value is $187,500 or less, and you're getting that highest exemption, you're not paying any school taxes. But as soon as it creeps beyond that, once you get to 190,000, you're paying those school taxes. And it makes a big difference, unfortunately.
Great, thank you. Um, I'm going to kind of combine the last two questions I have here in the chat. So one was, my 40% assessed value almost doubled. Do I qualify for a floating exemption? I live in DeKalb County, City of Atlanta.
So DeKalb County also has, they actually have a homestead exemption freeze that, and I think they opted into the new statewide one. So they're supposed to look at which one is most beneficial to you. So the DeKalb County taxes will also get, some benefit over time as far as doing what the taxable value is. That only applies to pieces of the bill. The existing one only applied to small pieces of the bill. I think the statewide one will apply to more. But DeKalb City School, well, actually, no, your City of Atlanta. So the City of Atlanta Schools doesn't have the exemption. Of course, neither does the DeKalb schools. So those are still going to be, as your value goes up, it's still going to affect the taxable value for those. Again, the homestead exemptions will help with that, but that's why you have to also consider appealing to try and keep the value down.
Thank you. In the other part, well, not of that question, but the second question I was going to ask, it was another clarity question regarding HB 581. So for clarity, HB 581 doesn't allow you to freeze your taxes for 3 years?
So, and again, I'm assuming that you're talking about the freeze that comes after you've appealed. And
Right.
581 allows for the freeze, but only if you've succeeded in getting a lower value. So let's say that the assessor said your home was worth 100,000. You argued that it's 50,000. The Board of Equalization decided it was $99,999. If you get that $1 reduction, you get a 3-year freeze. If the Board of Equalization says, no, we think it's 100,000, then you don't. It's just an unfortunate result of what HB 581 did.
Thank you so much for that. I have a question here on if you have any information on criteria for disabled veterans or a resource that we can point people to.
So the FultonAssessor.org website does have a homestead exemption pamphlet that describes it. Also, the Department of Revenue has it. The veterans exemption is basically, it's for the most part, if you're 100% service connected disabled, you're going to get the veterans disabled exemption. There are a few other categories. I'm not as familiar with what exactly the details are, because it goes into getting a certain type of housing assistance as a result of being a disabled veteran, and or if you've lost a certain number of limbs or eyes, or it's certain criteria for who would still qualify. But if you're 100% service connected disabled, then you definitely would be eligible for it. And actually, one of the things that I was reading that's pending in the legislature now is the possibility of giving a percentage of a discount to people who are disabled veterans who are not 100%, but who are, so I was saying, say you're 50%, then maybe getting a 50% reduction. I don't know if that'll pass though.
Thank you. And last question I have here in the chat was, it says, I'm looking at my house's improvement area compared to others, and I have 6 additional features listed. Could this be why my valuation is higher than other homes of the same size on my street? What do these additional fixtures mean?
That's a really good question. And the short answer is I don't know. What you'd want to do is look to see what it is they're evaluating. You can talk with your appraiser about, what are you counting here? Sometimes if you've got like what they call an auxiliary dwelling unit, that can make a big increase because it's basically another livable space on your property that that they're going to be taxing. If it's, you know, something small that doesn't really increase the value, then it may not make a difference at all. It just depends on what those things are.
Thank you. And I did get one question that came through that I think maybe I will post to you before I go looking for other resources for this student. But the question basically came around the application process, and it looks like there's a requirement that the driver's license lists the like the physical home address on the license, but this particular student lists a mailing address for their own personal reasons. Are there exceptions to your knowledge that can be made in those situations, or does the home address have to appear on the identification?
It's obviously a lot easier if the home address list is listed on the ID, but they should be able to use like utility bills or other things to support that you are the owner. You know, if you've got other utility bills and things like that in your name. The other thing I do want to mention is that they do require that if you have a vehicle, that it be registered at that property. So that sometimes trips people up. And if you've, you know, just haven't gotten around to getting it registered at the new place, go ahead and do that before you actually submit that application.
Awesome, thank you. So I hope I haven't missed anything. I believe that covered all the questions in the chat. I will do another pass here to see if anyone has any questions for Stacy this evening. Just raise your hand and we'll address you. Okay. If there are no other questions, what I wanted to do is just take us out.
Somebody raised their hand.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, my birthday is actually the 31st of March. I turned 65. So for April 1st, do I do the 65 exemption or the 62?
Unfortunately, you have to be 65 by January 1st. So,
Oh, okay.
so you would go
62.
ahead and apply for the 62 this year. And then after, after April 1st, go back and apply for the higher one for next year. Now, I will say that a lot of times what you get with the higher, as you age, you know, as you get into the older age ones, sometimes it's just the same exemptions, but they have a higher income threshold. And so you may qualify for one, you know, at a later age that you didn't qualify when you were younger. But it's worth at least looking to see if you would get something more by doing a new application after April 1st.
Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome, thank you. So really quick, just to bring us home here so that we can get back to it. Let me bring this over here. Sorry, guys. So I just wanted to let you all know, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening for this MP University course. I hope that you all got tons of information and have the resources that you need to take the next steps. Wanted to let you know about 3 upcoming courses that we have coming up next week, actually next Thursday, the 13th. We have our NP 101 class where you can learn a little bit more about how the NPU system works. I know we just had maybe a week ago, we had the history of the NPUs. This is going to tell you how the NPU is functioning today actively if you're a part of your NPU meetings. We have on Wednesday, March 26th, Introduction to Parliamentary Procedures. That is the first course in a 3-part series that goes over Robert's Rules of Order on how to conduct an efficient meeting. So if you are a community leader, you host community meetings, this definitely would be one that's fitting for you. And then just lastly, we have coming up on April 3rd, so a little less than a month away from now, we have the Mayor's Office of Sustainability and Resilience is offering Client Resilient ATL, Building Climate Resilience in Atlanta Communities Together. In this course, they'll be talking about their new climate action plan, how you can be involved. And so we're really excited to be hosting this course for them this year. As always, if you want to know more about the courses that we're offering or what's coming up, you can visit us at npuatlanta.org to find more information there. And then lastly, wanted to highlight our youth program that's coming up this summer in June. Civic Responsibility for Young Leaders is an immersive course where students will come to City Hall Monday through Friday. They're going to get to shadow city leaders. They're going to get to participate in a mock city council where they're actually working and preparing all the pieces and the documents for this mock council. It's a really fun time. They get a $525 stipend for full participation, as well as 35 hours of community service. So if you know a civic-minded rising high school junior or senior, please shoot this information their way or direct them to us. And we would love to have them join us at City Hall, or join us, at City Hall this summer. And that is it. One last thank you to everyone for joining us. Definitely please stay tuned. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and NPU Atlanta. Also YouTube, which actually isn't on there, but you can find us on YouTube at NPU Atlanta. And these courses, this one and prior ones, will be there available for review after. And then I'll close out with saying that we will be sending out the presentation materials as well as the link to the after course survey to everyone that attended tonight. Your feedback really helps us to keep programs like this and courses like this happening. So definitely let us know if you found this informative or if there was room for improvement. We're open to all feedback. So the link is in the chat right now if you want to grab it, but it'll also be coming to you via email as well. So I will stop sharing here. Thank you all again so much for joining. If there's no further questions, I hope everyone has a great rest of your evening.
Good night, everybody.
Would you be having a class to help seniors to file their applications?
I'm actually glad you asked that, because I should have put in a plug. We're partnering with the Atlanta Beltline Partnership and the Grove Park Foundation it'll actually be another information session this Monday, which will cover kind of what y'all just seen, but you may want the refresher. And then we'll have a actual workshop on the 15th at Pittsburgh Yards, and we encourage you to pre-register for that. So what I'll do is I'll make sure that the people who organize this get a copy of the flyer for that and send that out with all the other materials for this.
In that workshop, they'll actually be filling out the applications or assisting you with that?
Yes, and the aim is to do it as online applications, but especially what we want to do is help people with being able to upload the documents that they need to, especially if you're applying for one of those exemptions, or in one of those categories where you don't necessarily have the deed in your name. We want to make sure that you're getting everything in there.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you again, Stacy, for your time. Hope everyone here has a great evening and hope to see you at an upcoming course.
Thanks, everybody. Good night. And thank you, team.
Thank you.
Thanks.